Join me now, the former Foreign Secretary, former Defence Secretary, former Head of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Sir Malcolm, many thanks for being with us. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Just in terms of what you've heard from the government so far, in terms of the expulsion of diplomats, in terms of the sanctions and so on, has our response been proportionate, given the fact that we are still in a situation this morning where the government cannot be definitive that the Russian state was responsible for what happened in Salisbury?
Well, hold on. It can be as definitive as is remotely possible in these sort of circumstances. We have a very specialist nerve agent which has been identified as being Novichok. We know that that has only been manufactured in what was then the Soviet Union in a factory in Uzbekistan. It should all have been destroyed in the 1990s. And we find that it's now being used to attempt to kill people in the streets of one of our cities. Now, either the Russian government authorized it or they allowed the material to get into the hands of those who did.
Given that, should we not perhaps have been slightly stronger than the expulsion of diplomats?
It's difficult to know what you're referring to. First of all, the number of diplomats that were expelled was 40%, almost half, of the Russian embassy. That's a higher proportion than any previous occasion when diplomats have been expelled. In addition, we're not naive. The government knows perfectly well the Russians were likely to retaliate, as has now happened, and therefore I'm assuming, and I think I've got every reason, as we all have, to assume, there will be a second package of measures announced in the very near future.
Isn't it the case, though, Sir Malcolm, that the only reason we're pushing forward with the Magnitsky proposals is because of events in Salisbury?
Well, we are doing two things. We are looking at, I'm not in the government, so I'm anticipating what the government is likely to be doing. But
indeed.
The government is doing two things. It is looking at what is inherently linked to the cause of this crisis. And when we are dealing with a Russian attack on people in a British city, then now is the time, for example, to take very tough measures. Perhaps they should have been taken earlier against some of Putin's cronies who are friends, part of his inner circle, who live in London or who have property or assets in London and need to be dealt with, because Putin is not just a one-man state. He is surrounded by cronies, by some oligarchs, some of whom have links with the United Kingdom, and action can be taken against their assets. That will hurt, and indirectly it will hurt Putin as well. The Magnitsky affair, I think that should have been dealt with at an earlier stage, and that is measures that punish individuals from the Russian state who are believed to be responsible for serious human rights violations.
Well, in a sense, then, as you were saying, some of these proposals could have been pushed forward earlier. I mean, is there a sense...
I said one of the proposals.
Yeah,
not
indeed. Sorry, apologies. Is there a sense, then, in which the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has taken its eye off the ball somewhat? I mean, in the past few years, we've had Crimea, we've had Ukraine, Malaysia Airlines 17. You know, we know, for example, that there were troops operating in the east of Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russian Premier said that they weren't. He has lied on a number of occasions. Should we have been tougher sooner, a lot tougher sooner? Have they taken
all the other examples you've mentioned were not specific attacks on the United Kingdom, including a United Kingdom citizen. They were Russia's international policy, and therefore it required a NATO response and an international response. And there was a response. The European Union is imposing on Russia over Ukraine, and we were very instrumental in bringing this about, the toughest sanctions Russia has ever faced.
What do you make of the
financial and banking sanctions? I'm banned from Russia at the moment for having been one of those calling for these sanctions.
And I'm sure it was on your to-do list to head to Moscow sometime soon as well. In terms of what Boris Johnson has said about Jeremy Corbyn, there's been a huge focus on the way in which the leader of the opposition responded, from his own backbenches as much as the Conservative benches. But do you believe that perhaps that the Foreign Secretary went just a little bit too far when he claimed that Mr Corbyn had let down his country?
Well, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. I'm hoping someone in our office will be able to bring you some water.
And colourful language is often used, and that's what happened on this occasion.
Colourful language, though. I mean, it was a point I was making to your party chairman just a few moments ago. The idea that at a time such as this, rhetoric like that can be deployed. It seems strange that someone like Boris Johnson, fully in command of the English language, would choose to be so sharp?
Well, you say it was so sharp. What's wrong with being sharp? The circumstances justified sharpness, I would have thought. What is it you're objecting to that he said?
Well, he said that he had let down the country, and I'm wondering why, when the questions that he asked were about the involvement of the OPCW, whether or not we'd had conversations with our NATO allies, and whether there was, support for multilateral moving forward. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? We've had lots of fine words from the Americans and many others, but actually, as things stand, the only people that are taking any action are Britain.
No. Look, whenever there has been an attack in the United States or in France or in Germany, obviously the country in question leads the response and hopes that its allies will give it full support. We have had full support from America, from France and Germany. It's interesting, in the first immediate response after Mrs. May's announcement, the French appeared to be rather unhappy about going along with our response. In fact, they reconsidered that, and President Macron has given as much support as President Trump and Angela Merkel. So I don't think we have any cause to be concerned about that.
As someone equally in command of the English language as Boris Johnson, I wonder what you made of Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary's remarks, telling the Russians to shut up and go away.
Well, Gavin Williamson is Defence Secretary, Boris Johnson is Foreign Secretary. I've done both jobs, and what I discovered is when you're in the Foreign Office, you have to be always very, very diplomatic. In the Ministry of Defence, you mix with the military. They can sometimes be blunter in the language they use, and I think Gavin Williamson is perhaps reflecting the culture of the Ministry of Defence more than the traditional, rather specialist diplomatic language which the Foreign Office favours. I think that's a very good answer to your question.
Well, let us both hope that Mr. Williamson doesn't get any earthier, shall we? Sir Malcolm Rifkind, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.